When it comes to the idea of the perfect antagonist, this is a very tricky concept to talk about as it has multiple variables that affect the writing of said antagonist. And this is the first video I've scripted in forever. I don't usually script my videos because it's so time consuming, but I really wanted to script this one and hopefully do a good job. Quote, "A good antagonist-like conflict feeds the narrative. As you say, without a strong antagonist, the story falls away. But an antagonist must do more than give the hero something to do. They have to be focused on what they want." End quote. That opening statement and quote taken from 3 writers discussing what makes a proper antagonist stand out and capture the hearts of the viewer is exactly what I want to use today. Similar to what Super Eyepatch Wolf did in his video about what makes a villain feel real, here I want to take the time to look at some of anime and manga's greatest antagonistic forces. The main examples I'm going to go through in this video aren't the only examples of phenomenal antagonists, and they won't be the only ones I use, but if not, these 3 in my estimation are by far head and shoulders above most, and serve as clear-cut examples of how to write the perfect antagonist. But before getting into that, if you are new to the channel, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the bell notifications. And without further ado, cue the intro. Introducing your antagonistic force can be done in a variety of ways, and is not limited in my view at what point within the series one can introduce said character. But upon observation of the 3 prime examples, being Johan, Griffith, and Funny Valentine, shout out to friend from 20th Century Boys, it is often best to make that force that will be pushing against the protagonist clear from an earlier stage within the story or arc. This can be done by having the character give an appearance early on without them taking any major action like Funny Valentine or Griffith, or with other good examples like Frieza from Dragon Ball Z and Pain from Naruto, who are built up by small moments of action and quotes of reference from other characters about how terrifying this antagonist is. What this does is now set the stage and offers a good amount of hype and build up for the antagonist to then enter and leave his mark. This requires a good deal of skill when you're deciding how much you want to reveal before the climax, or whether you want the philosophy that makes up the character's core revealed during the climax. It can be done either way, but when it comes to a morally gray antagonist, as is the case with a character like Valentine or Pain, having them converse with the protagonist during the climax can often be their most memorable moment. Cycle of Hatred, Valentine's speech on patriotism, Johan's quote about death, or Griffith telling Guts about his dream on the Hill of Swords, are great examples of the antagonist cementing their motive during a moment of great tension. However, an antagonist does not have to be morally gray to be a good one. Just look at Doflamingo and or again Frieza. These are 2 antagonists that I would consider more quote-unquote pure evil, and whatever evil philosophy or motivation they have is made clear before the climax to both the audience and the protagonist themselves. Essentially, the presence of the antagonist should be made clear from the beginning of the arc or story, but the motivation or cause of them serving that role can be spread or divided across different moments, either before or during the climax. This is one of the key things that I believe to truly separate the okay antagonists to the great ones. You see, paralleling the protagonist can show and add a feeling of tension between the 2 forces, as it shows, since the 2 have common ground, that there is some sort of relationship between the 2, as is the case with, again, Naruto versus Gaara or Obito or Pain, communicating the message that they have shared or similar life experiences and circumstances, but one was just more fortunate than the other not to fall down a dark path. Therefore, doing one of the key functions of the antagonist, and that is to push the limits of the protagonist. By making the protagonist see that he is in fact super similar to the very thing he despises, it forces him to look within himself to see why is he different, and to really question if he's that different to begin with. This is sort of like the dynamic of 2 sides of the same coin, if you will. And this is done greatly with Griffith, as he parallels Guts in the darkness within, along with the ability to stand out amongst other men, both serving as sources of inspiration for people. But what Griffith also does is contrast Guts, which all great antagonists tend to do. They contrast their protagonist. Now, the way one can contrast the protagonist can be done in many different ways and on multiple levels. Aesthetics and appearance can be a subtle way to do so, again look at Guts and Griffith. One is dressed in all black, one is dressed in all white, and it's a simple thing until you realize some of the thematic reasonings behind it and all that stuff, but regardless, still a good example. You can also see this done in the sense of what the character's abilities are. We see this with Kira and Josuke in part 4. Josuke having the power to heal what he touches, while Kira has the power to destroy whatever he touches. Of course, there are bigger levels that we're about to get into of doing so, but I think having this parallel or contrast in such minor subtle things really shows an attention to detail from the author, in my opinion. Now, the bigger examples of contrast are in the philosophy or the core of what makes each character special. Once again, Guts being a person with no singular goal or ambition, as well as a character who takes personal responsibility, versus Griffith who's focused on one goal with one great ambition, who will put the responsibility or consequences of his actions on others if it is convenient. But if there was a clear-cut example that would require less of an analysis in a contrast of philosophy, would be the one between Johan and Dr. Tenma. Tenma believing all human life is equal, and one shouldn't prioritize the life of one over another all because the one is a more important individual to society, versus Johan who simply puts it as,
でも、もう気づいたでしょ。誰にも平等なのは死だけだ。
Having some parallels and contrasts on not only the appearance or design of the characters, but more so the ideologies and morals of the protagonist and antagonist, adds a rich sense of quality within the themes of a series or arc, and also adds a deep emotional connection to the outcome of the confrontation, making it memorable and truly showing of the immense quality of the antagonist that has been built up for the very moment. Now, going back to the point I just made about paralleling and contrasting the protagonist, I think that truly pushes the protagonist to his or her limit, forcing the character to either hold on even tighter to what he or she believes in, or to violate the heroic aspect of who they are to overcome this foe. Tenma's close to violating his stance on human life, and he even takes a life during the story, something he was incapable of doing before his quest to take down Johan, but the circumstances Johan pushed him into causes Tenma to decide what he would consider the lesser of two evils. And as a man who dedicated his whole life to saving other lives, would now have to take a life to save even more. It was Tenma who saved Johan and created the monster, see what I did there? That now pushes him to decide now what a true hero is. But think about this for a moment. All those deep aspects of Tenma would not be true without Johan. Johan is required to be the way he is within the story to prompt Tenma's development as a character. Johan contrasting Tenma the way he does and forcing Tenma to grow only speaks to the greatness of Johan as an antagonist, therefore fulfilling what makes a great antagonist, well, great. He has already been built up from the beginning of the story, and now by serving as a clear contrast to Tenma, Johan forces Tenma to develop or collapse as a character, pushing him to the brink. By forcing the protagonist to react and grow not only pushes the narrative of the story, but elevates the quality of the protagonist and in turn the story as a whole. Let me give you another example. This is shown again with Funny Valentine as he reveals his patriotic motives behind why he is causing all this chaos to Johnny. During the peak of the conflict, or the climax of the confrontation if you will, Valentine then challenges Johnny with a quote-unquote "this is for the greater good" mentality, showing his humanity and being fully aware that the actions he's committing aren't pure, hence dirty deeds done dirt cheap. This causes Johnny to come to a crossroads, whether he will also strive for the greater good Valentine has in his mind, or to punish Valentine for his immoral actions. This helps truly give Part 7 an overall higher quality, as all the actions done up to this point have been to stop Valentine, but now forcing the protagonist to look at this objectively and now from his emotional and moral point of view now adds even more to the climax that Part 7 has been building up the whole time. Once again, pushing the protagonist, pushing the narrative, and enriching the themes and actions within the story. Now, just so I could give another example with slightly different circumstances and to make the point a little bit more clear, I'll give a third example. Besides, I love talking about Berserk, so it's time to talk about Griffith again. If there was ever an example of an antagonist pushing the narrative, and more so the protagonist, it would be Griffith. As a man with great ambition and goal, Griffith pushes Guts before even becoming the antagonist of the story, pushing Guts to seek his own dream and leave to be an equal to Griffith. In turn, this pushes the narrative of the story, as it is this turning point in Guts' character prompted by Griffith that sets off a chain reaction that leads to the eclipse. So even from an early stage, Griffith is pushing the protagonist and well pushing the narrative because the entire Golden Age arc is pretty much Guts and Griffith running up on an entire kingdom. But in an ironic turn of events, it was Griffith, the man with ambition, who was pushed to the brink. He then committed the unforgivable act of sacrificing the Band of the Hawk and violating Casca in front of Guts. This is where things truly take an interesting turn when you look at it, because it was Griffith who pushed Guts to improve and to no longer just be a killing machine without a goal or ambition. This is what led Guts to leave, which is what pushed Griffith to the state he was in when he sacrificed the hawk, which in turn then pushed Guts back into being the vengeful killing machine, and now Guts is forced to once again grow and regain all of the things he lost to Griffith and the God Hand. To sum it up a little bit, there's a lot of pushing and shoving on both sides. As is shown with other examples, but mostly this one, is that the protagonist can also push the antagonist as hard as the antagonist pushes the protagonist, which in turn only helps the overall drive within the series and once again makes the two better, but in a way also inseparable from one another. It's essentially a game of pushing one another until ultimately one force comes out on top. Now this one ties into the last one very much, but I think they're still distinct enough and equally important points that need to be brought up separately. Now all of the things that I brought up earlier about Johann, Valentine, and Griffith are only possible because they are the dominant force within the story when they are the driving force. There are times, as I brought up with Guts and Griffith, that both of them can serve as the driving forces within the story, which is perfectly fine, but usually you want the antagonist to be the dominant force out of the two. Being the dominant force within the story requires the protagonist to grow, but it also adds a sense of true fear and terror to the antagonist in the story. This causes whatever conflict is happening at the moment to truly feel more tense, because if the antagonist is the dominant force, it makes us the audience very aware that there has to be growth from the protagonist in order to even compete, adding a sense of urgency and once again true fear of what could happen if the antagonist is just too much. Bondrewd from Made in Abyss, a truly terrifying foe. But why is that? Is it his sick and twisted experiments? Well, yeah, but it's more than that. It's the fact that no one can really stop him. If Bondrewd wasn't the dominant force, then whatever acts of evil he commits truly has no weight, since the protagonist can just step in and remove all sense of danger. Why do you think it's so difficult for Superman to be compelling unless Doomsday or some other being of that power or greater power is present? Because Superman is the dominant force, and therefore it doesn't really matter what any villain does because they could just easily be stopped, and after a while that gets boring. But flip the script and make Superman the antagonistic force instead of the protagonist of the story. See what I mean? But going back to Bondrewd, it's evident that he is the dominant force, and it will require everything the protagonists have to defeat him. This does two things. Again, one, it pushes the protagonist in the narrative, but two, it demands the audience to respect the antagonist. If you don't respect or see danger in the antagonist of the story or arc, that story or arc falls apart. The conflict between the protagonist and antagonist needs to be big, super climactic, and memorable. But if the conflict is underwhelming or dealt with poorly, it can easily sully everything that has been built up to that point. Making the antagonist the dominant force truly adds the biggest emotional value to any confrontation or story, while elevating the protagonist to new heights. Some simple examples of this being done is with Frieza pushing Goku to turn Super Saiyan, Doflamingo pushing Luffy to achieve a new form, and Naruto being pushed by Pain to achieve Sage Mode. These are examples more based around power, but those three antagonists were the dominant force until the protagonist was pushed above their level in the final confrontation. Being the dominant force out of the two throughout the beginning up until the peak of the climax truly makes the antagonist feel like he is in control of the events that happen, therefore having an unforgettable chokehold on the plot and narrative, allowing the antagonist to not even need to be present, but his impact is still lingering as long as the dominant force is still him. Friend from 20th Century Boys, Johann from Monster, and I guess if you want to throw in Aaron from Attack on Titan currently, all fit that description. Unless you're One Punch Man, having the antagonist be the dominant presence adds an immense amount of danger, suspense, and intrigue to the moment. Now this one might go a bit unnoticed, but I think it's extremely essential in really adding a sense of natural conflict and a realistic motive for conflict in the first place. The antagonist must have a reason to do what he is currently doing or what he has done, and it must be that goal or desire that causes conflict with the protagonist and the goals and desires the protagonist has. If the protagonist only wants to defeat the antagonist because he sees the antagonist as evil, and that's the only thing that's there, it falls flat, and once you try to see more substance behind the conflict, it runs shallow and in turn does not have the same emotional impact or the need to push one another. But if the protagonist's goals and ideologies contrast and conflict with the antagonist, now the need for conflict has more substance and more is on the line. The conflict now seems natural, and the antagonist now feels like his own character and not just some force the audience can't relate or sympathize with. Griffith is relatable and human because of the flaws he demonstrated when trying to accomplish his goal. Same applies with Johan and Valentine. Without their own personal goal, there is no build-up. There's no pushing of the narrative, there's no contrast or parallel with the protagonist, and ultimately, there's no real need for conflict. Going back to the quote that I opened up the video with, the antagonist must do more than give the hero something to do. They have to be focused on what they want. And the goal itself matters for sure, but if there's no goal period outside of just being evil for evil's sake, then the antagonist has no real foundation to build off of. There has to be a desire and a goal that portrays the philosophy and internal desire of the antagonist. And this isn't only the foundation for the antagonist, but it's also what allows the story itself to flow more smoothly. Then when the final confrontation happens, the level of emotion is so intense, because now what we see is if the protagonist can prevail and if all we've learned to love about our protagonist will stand in the end. Or will the antagonist become the winner and prove his goal and ideology was the stronger one? I think if no time is given to the antagonist, or for the audience to see the antagonist accomplish their ideologies and goals and finding out the reasoning behind why they have said goal, when the final confrontation does happen, it tends to fall flat. I think the true emotion behind why this final confrontation has to be so big and as to why it's very important for each one to have their own sense of justice when it comes to the protagonist and the antagonist is put into context when Doflamingo said,
正義は勝つって?そりゃそうだろう。勝者だけが正義だ!
Hopefully you enjoyed this video. I really try to do better than what I tend to do on most of my videos. And again, if you are new to the channel, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, turn on the bell notifications. That way you're notified when a new video pops up on some of your favorite anime, manga, or whatever content. As always, this has been The Masked Man. Hope everyone has a blessed rest of the day, and peace.